Darum fordern wir Vernichtung des Systems der Ausbeutung. Her mit dem deutschen Arbeiterstaat, Deutschland den Deutschen.
Past and present. In the Weimar Republic, the ideology of ethno-nationalism was widespread and eventually became the foundation of the Nazi regime.
The extreme right in Germany today is clearly drawing upon this old folkish ideology, this ethno-nationalism.
Right-wing extremists today are stoking fears of immigration and what they call the Great Replacement.
The Great Replacement is when the majority population, the native population, is displaced and replaced by a minority, when the ethnic composition of a population is turned on its head.
And once again, the new right's ethno-nationalist ideas are accompanied by racism and anti-Semitism.
Everyone knows which old parasites we're talking about.
The new right rejects today's Germany and believes the time is ripe for a national transformation.
There's a belief, I think it's a delusional one, that the time has come to overthrow the system they hate, to overthrow democracy.
What does the Germany of today have to do with the Weimar Republic of nearly a century ago? What do they have in common? What parallels can we draw to a time just before the Nazi regime seized power, sweeping away hope, freedom, and peace?
There's this simple and catchy slogan, Berlin is not Weimar. That's a trivialization of history. Historical constellations don't repeat themselves in this one-to-one kind of way. The slogan also offers a kind of false reassurance. It implies we don't need to give much thought to anti-democratic developments that might be underway. It suggests that this comparison is meaningless. But I believe that some of what's happening now requires us to do exactly that, to undertake this comparison. The same kind of assault on democracy that happened in the Weimar Republic is being revived in a big way.
History might not repeat itself, but we can still learn from it. Students at a high school in Cologne are rehearsing a play about Holocaust survivor Tamar Dreyfus, who lost much of her family in the Nazi concentration camps. Working with Germany's Association for Information and Counseling for the Survivors of Nazi Persecution, they want to show how her story is still relevant to the present day.
By performing this piece, we might be able to get people interested in the whole issue again.
The past is important. We can learn from it so that we don't make the same mistakes.
In school, you notice that jokes about Jews have become funny again. Those kinds of jokes are acceptable again.
Tamar Dreyfus has also observed the reemergence of racism and anti-Semitism and believes that something needs to be done now to counter the trend. You once said remembering isn't enough, we have to act. What if that doesn't happen?
That would be bad. Then it will grow. We have to keep repeating this message day in and day out. Some people may say, we don't want this, we don't want to hear this anymore, it's over. But you have to remember, without remembrance there is no future.
Berlin in 1929, during the Weimar Republic, 11 years after the end of the First World War. Germany had been a democracy for 10 years, but now its enemies were circling, rallying on the streets and even in parliament.
We have seen that this new German parliamentary and party system is hypocritical and socially corrupt. It is an enemy of our fatherland.
Alfred Hugenberg was chairman of the German National People's Party and a leader of the right.
At the time, political parties in the Weimar Republic were under attack. There was a widespread feeling that Germans didn't need multiple political parties. All they needed was a single true representative of the people, a strong leader, a strong single party. That's what we're seeing again today. The populist or radical right are saying, we are the true people, we represent the people. Everyone else is being manipulated and is acting against the people's interests.
The major parties have been preying on the state and turned the government of our nation and people into an arena for ideological experiments. The AfD is our country's last chance to evolve in the right direction. Otherwise, we must prepare to fight.
Andreas Kalbitz is leader of the AfD in Brandenburg and has extensive contacts with neo-Nazi youth organizations. The party is putting its faith in the younger generations. Many in the Weimar Republic also recognized the importance of youth organizations. Churches, professional associations, sports clubs, and political parties all expected the post-war generation to grab the reins and shape the country's future. By the time the Nazis had seized power, it was not just the Hitler Youth who had been converted. Many young people believed that democracy had become obsolete, tarnished by the older generation that had led Germany into the First World War. Ideas of race and ethnicity had become the hallmark of national unity. The individual was nothing, the people everything. Their bond to blood and soil was to be purged of alien elements, leaving behind only the pure body of the people.
There could be no contradictions within this supposedly biologically pure national community, the body of the people. It couldn't countenance any form of plurality. Conflicts of interest, competing interests had to be quashed. All of these things that we now accept as part of modern mass society were rejected as fundamentally hostile.
Germany's student fraternities were part of this youth movement. By 1924, their writings were drawing on these ideas. The ethnic nation is the source of political action. Every citizen is obligated to act in the national interest. Their actions must be guided only by the desire to preserve and promote the ethnic lifeway of our people.
The traditions of the German fraternities also draw on the ethno-nationalist and anti-Semitic ideologies of the 1920s and 30s. Then as now, fraternities serve as a breeding ground for radical right-wing parties and think tanks, and for the whole right-wing apparatus.
The German fraternities are still the elite schools of Germany's extreme right. Their traditions are unchanged. But how much of this ethno-nationalist ideology still remains? We meet the fraternity's spokesman Philipp Stein in Halle.
What I want is for peoples and populations to preserve their relative homogeneity, their traditions.
How's that different from Nazi racial theory?
Well, racial theory is based on something very different. Ethnicity doesn't mean everyone is blonde, everyone has beautiful straight teeth, or a particular shape of skull. A people is made up of a variety of qualities that have evolved organically over the centuries.
I'm asking about this tradition of racial theory because it also involved this fear of intermingling.
Well, as I've explained, kinship and identity, along with language and religious confession, are some of the things that define a nation. And of course, kinship and identity include some things that have nothing to do with racial theory, but just with forms of expression, with human forms.
Like what?
Well, take a look around. It's pretty easy for me to see that you're a German or European. So it's pretty clear that certain physical characteristics define a people. Well, at least most of what I would call a people. That's actually a pretty ordinary fact.
But that's a racist or racial point of view.
Why racial? I don't want to somehow define people by the shape of their skulls or the kind of crazy stuff that the National Socialists propagated. It just goes without saying that certain characteristics are what define the identity of a people.
So where are these ideas coming from?
This This existential racist mode of thought has been part of radical right-wing ideology for some 200 years. It's constantly finding new language and new terminology for its ideas, like substituting the word race with words like culture or identity. They want society to be homogeneous along ethnic lines, to change the things that define Germany as a state. Today, many people who are obviously German citizens are not perceived as Germans through the prism of ethno-nationalism. That's what they want.
Tamar Dreyfus witnessed how racism and anti-Semitism gave rise to segregation, persecution, and murder. She and her family lived in the Lithuanian capital of Vilnius. In 1941, when she was 3 years old, the German army occupied the city. Her mother hid her, but then she and her parents were rounded up and sent to the city's Jewish ghetto. One day her father was taken away and shot. Not long afterwards, Tamar and her mother were put on a train to a death camp. Along the way, the train made a brief stop. Her mother saw a chance to escape. As if by a miracle, they got away unnoticed and went underground for years, and survived. Tamar Dreyfus has been living in Cologne for many years. Today she feels that she's witnessing a revival of the past, a resurgent racism and hostility towards immigrants, nourished by the very same ideology. She feels an obligation to tell her story, educate people, and warn them.
My fate is probably to stay here and do what I do. I mean, this is like a drop of water on a hot stone. But many drops can make stone melt, and I hope I've collected a lot of drops in my time.
Today, nationalism has returned to Germany's streets under the guise of a right-wing protest movement. Fears of a nation under threat, of national decline, are being whipped up to justify the anger.
The smell of decay from a dying democracy is wafting through the country. In this situation, dear friends, and I say this as a citizen loyal to the state, our duty is not to remain calm. Our civic duty is one of courage, anger, defiance, and civil disobedience. We must take our country back.
Das Vaterland ist in Gefahr. Die Nation steht vor dem Abgrund. Das Volk verzweifelt. Wenn es uns nicht gelingt, die Dinge entscheidend zu wenden, dann müssen wir jede Hoffnung auf eine neue deutsche Zukunft begraben.
The radical right, both in the 1920s and today, regard liberal democracy as a process of decline and decay. It supposedly leads to crime, to infiltration by foreigners and other disasters. This view doesn't have much to do with reality.
In the Weimar Republic, monarchists and supporters of a one-party system saw Parliament and the democratic parties as the enemy. The Social Democrats, with their ideas of liberalism, were especially hated. The Communists were agitating from the left, the DNVP, and increasingly the Nazi Party, from the right. They called for parliament and political parties to be abolished.
Wir sind intolerant. Ich habe mir ein Ziel gesteckt, nämlich die 30 Parteien aus Deutschland hinauszufegen. Das System als System ist falsch. Die Parteien müssen weg. Wir wollen als einzige deutsche Bewegung an ihre Stelle treten.
Today, the AfD is trying to claim the mantle of savior. They see the government and other political parties as enemies of the people.
The traditional political parties are trapped in their multicultural Republican matrix. They're musty, outdated, cowardly.
Dear friends, the Chancellor wants to create a fait accompli before she resigns. She wants to make the great replacement irreversible. Don't ask me what her motives are. For some reason, she has something against the German people.
They want to create a different country, a country without immigrant families, a country without a liberal culture and a cosmopolitan globalized economy. They're essentially talking about a form of National Socialism.
In the German parliament, the Bundestag, the AfD serves as a catch-all for the far right. It survives by whipping up discontent and anger. Many AfD voters have lost faith in the state and political system. Only 1 to 4% of voters from the mainstream established parties say they're dissatisfied with democracy in Germany. But among left-wing voters, that figure is 31%. Among AfD voters, 41%. This dissatisfaction with the democratic system, paired with ethnonationalism, has also drawn reams of middle-class voters, many of whom share these views.
Even before the AfD was founded, a certain segment in German society held much more conservative, if not to say right-wing and even racist views, than were reflected in Angela Merkel's Christian Democratic Party. But there was no one on the stage who said this openly or with an air of credibility and legitimacy. The AfD has succeeded in doing just that. And now racist values and worldviews are not just being thought, but openly expressed. Right-wing extremist beliefs also exist in the center of society, that we like to think of as a kind of bastion, a line of defense. We tend to think of right-wing extremism as taking place on the political fringe, something that you can get back under control because it's just an isolated minority. But that's not really true. These attitudes are widespread. You'll find them in many segments of society.
Right-wing extremism can persist over generations. This is shown by a study conducted by the University of Munich, which examined Rhineland-Palatinate and Baden-Württemberg, 2 federal states where immigration has been less of a factor. They found that areas that voted for the Nazis in 1933, shown here in red, gave a larger share of their vote to the AfD in the 2017 parliamentary elections, shown here in blue.
There are astonishing continuities in electoral behavior that go back to the time of National Socialism. This shows us that the political culture, radical right-wing attitudes, don't suddenly disappear or change overnight. There's continuity. These attitudes are passed down in families and communities.
The new far right and the AfD cut their teeth on the streets. This is where they recruit their followers. Just like the Nazis in the Weimar Republic. At first, the Nazis were an irrelevant fringe movement, but they were determined to become a visible force and to grow.
Der Nationalsozialismus ist keine Partei im alltäglichen Sinne dieses Wortes. Ist eine Bewegung, die sich zum Ziele gesetzt hat, das ganze deutsche Volk in all seinen Klassen, Ständen, Berufen und Bekenntnissen zu umspannen.
To avoid betraying its stated mission, the AfD has to remain a movement. In other words, it always has to be visible on the streets, and it needs to maintain close contacts with other affiliated movements.
Being a visible force on the streets in protests is essential to radical tendencies. It makes a statement. Here we are. Join us. Follow us. We're in the vanguard and ready to fight.
This tactic was also deployed in the Weimar Republic. Fiery rhetoric soon turned into violence. Street brawls became the order of the day. The radicals set out to destabilize the state and demonstrate its powerlessness. 1931 saw the Nazis committing their first anti-Semitic attacks, hunting down Jews on one of Berlin's main shopping boulevards. September 2018 in Chemnitz, open hostility on the streets, attacks on journalists, a hunt on people perceived as foreigners or migrants. Racism was openly flaunted, and hatred spilled into violence.
This tendency towards violence isn't just an abstract idea, it's being acted upon. I think we lost sight of the fact that we've had a militant subculture with an affinity for terrorism in this scene for a long time. They've been waiting in the wings for the right moment to put their violence into action on the streets.
The far left shares those tendencies, as was on evidence at the G20 summit in Hamburg 2 years ago. They also resorted to violence. But there is a crucial difference.
The radical left isn't trying to overthrow democracy, but to overthrow capitalism. The radical right wants to do away with democracy and human rights. This difference is also apparent in their behavior on the streets. As a rule, left-wing violence is directed primarily against objects and signifiers of the state. Right-wing violence also targets the state, but it also tends to hunt down minorities and attack people, not objects.
The AfD and their allies are still a minority, but they claim to represent a silent majority. They openly express racial ideologies and notions of ethnic purity. They themselves admit that the recent arrival of refugees in Germany was a boon to their movement.
Of course, the great migration crisis that started in 2015 has been a kind of catalyst for patriotic or right-wing ideas or whatever. I don't think anyone would deny that. There was a moment when these opinions were able to gain momentum, when what people were willing to say out loud really expanded. You can talk about things now that were more difficult a few years ago.
The limits of what can be said openly and in public without immediate sanction have shifted substantially in Germany over the last few years. I think everyone agrees on that. It's worrying that radical slogans, including a kind of rhetorical violence, are now not just limited to social media, where it's long been a real problem. Now it's left the digital world and gone analog, into the public sphere.
Far-right groups such as Pegida and the identitarian movement are moving onto Germany's streets. The identitarian movement may be a throwback, but as this promotional video shows, it presents itself as hip, young, and forward-thinking. Like their other allies on the far right, they want to draw young people into the movement. The identitarians are skilled at attracting attention, like at this 2016 protest at the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin, and their campaign on the French Alps for a Mediterranean mission, to keep refugees out rather than to rescue them. Martin Sellner has mounted campaigns in Austria, Germany, and across Europe, proclaiming the supposed downfall of society. He also plays down the crimes committed by the Nazis, claiming that traditional democratic politicians have become mired in what he calls a cult of guilt.
For years, this elite has been searching for a sword to fall onto. Now they've found one, the migration crisis. This is a society, a generation of death and voluntary liquidation. The identitarians want to be a force of life. So we say this to that elite: you're welcome to sacrifice yourselves, to destroy yourselves with your cult of guilt. That's your right, but you don't have the right to drag the rest of us into this.
The identitarian movement is being monitored as an extremist organization by Germany's security services. The identitarians say they want to protect the purity of supposedly homogeneous ethnic groups. The Great Replacement is its unifying narrative and features prominently in a manifesto by one of the movement's leaders. The ethnic German population will be displaced in the coming decades, replaced by migrants who do not share our culture. The 21st century is about nothing less than the survival of our people and the whole of Europe.
The idea that the population will be supplanted, that there'll be something like a great replacement, as the new right calls it, is widespread. This is a core element of the new radical right-wing ideology. It's a response to migration, the globalization of the population, and demographic change.
Alexander Kleiner, who calls himself Alex Malenki, is the leader of the identitarian movement in Leipzig. His aim is to convince young people that the Great Replacement is real. He and Philipp Thaler run the right-wing YouTube channel Laut Gedacht, or Thinking Out Loud.
By now, everyone should have realized that anyone who doesn't follow the green eco-mainstream or who's not interested in immigration is immediately branded a Nazi. They're trying to marginalize us.
The Great Replacement. I've seen that a lot in your literature. What is it?
The Great Replacement is when the majority, the native population, is displaced and replaced by others. When a population's ethnic composition is upended. So if we take Germany as a concrete example, then the Great Replacement would mean that people born and bred in Frankfurt would no longer be the majority in their own city.
And who decides who's German and who isn't?
It's not a decision. There is no decision, and no authority can make one. It's a process.
But you have decided who's German and who isn't. And if Frankfurt has lots of immigrants, you say no, they're not German, and we don't want to live this way.
Yes, we don't want Germans to become a minority in their own country.
So people whose families came here from somewhere else aren't Germans?
Sorry, what?
People with a migration background aren't Germans?
In a way, it depends on exactly where they came from and your definition of what is a German, yes.
But the vast majority of people with migrant backgrounds in Germany are Germans.
They're German citizens. But can a piece of paper be the final word in defining who is a German and who isn't?
What they're saying violates our concept of citizenship and the values of our constitution. When they say that people are not German because of their heritage, that's a modern form of racism. A German is a person who's a German citizen, and that's what the new right is unwilling to accept.
The ideology of the Great Replacement unites right-wing extremists around the world. On March 15, 2019, in Christchurch, New Zealand, a right-wing extremist shot dead 50 people who were praying in 2 mosques. The killer filmed his rampage and streamed it live on the internet, harvesting clicks and likes from right-wing extremists. Before the attack, Brenton Tarrant penned a manifesto claiming that the white race in Western countries was being replaced because of its lower birth rate. It was titled The Great Replacement, the same ideology that underlies the identitarian movement. And there was also a direct connection to Martin Sellner, mouthpiece of the identitarians. Martin Sellner was forced to admit that Tarrant had donated 1,500 euros to his private account a year before the attack.
The terrorist's donation to the identitarian movement demonstrates ideological sympathy or proximity. He also said that he donated to other nationalist movements. This is a very clear indication that the Christchurch killer was a fan of the identitarian movement.
The identitarian movement has set up what it calls a patriotic bar behind the barred windows of this house in Halle. Several far-right activists are holding a meeting here. We're allowed inside, but aren't allowed to ask any questions. Alex Malenki says the killer's donation to Martin Sellner was no big deal.
This whole thing is a farce. It could happen to anyone. Tomorrow, someone could throw 10 euros into your mailbox. Just saying.
Was this just a random donation, unsolicited and unwanted? It turns out that Zellner replied to Brandon Tarrant's email. I want to thank you personally for your incredible donation. This is my personal email address. If you want, you can contact me here. Martin Zellner continues to paint himself as the victim. But he doesn't seem to reject violence in principle, only for strategic reasons.
Non-violence in activism does not mean being defenseless. In my opinion, it should be coupled with a genuine willingness to fight. We do that as a conscious decision for metapolitical and strategic reasons. We know it's better and more effective.
So avoiding violence may only be a temporary tactic. An event attended by numerous AfD officials. The speakers openly professed the doctrine of the Great Replacement.
The federal government wants us to work for the immigrants so that they can keep bearing children and complete the population exchange.
These conquerors disguised as refugees just want to prey on our society. Our dear people are deeply divided. And now, the declining birth rate and mass immigration is posing a fundamental threat to their existence.
The idea of an existential threat to the German people was also put forth by Nazis during the Weimar Republic. Hitler propagated his racial ideology early on, directing it against anyone he saw as alien to the German nation. But at that time, many people didn't see the danger in it.
Eine gläubige Gemeinschaft von Menschen ist erstanden, die entschlossen ist, den Kampf für die Erhaltung unserer Rasse aufzunehmen. Wir Nationalsozialisten marschieren daher auch in jede Wahl hinein mit dem einzigen Bekenntnis, am nächsten Tage die Arbeit wieder erneut aufzunehmen für die innere Reorganisation unseres Volkskörpers.
In Nazi ideology, this supposed body of the nation was made up only of what they called Aryan Germans. Jews didn't belong, even if their families had been in Germany for generations.
Einmal wird unsere Geduld zu Ende sein und dann wird den Juden das freche Lügenmaul gestopft werden.
Wenn eine Muslim in diesem Land dieses Nein.
If a Muslim in this country doesn't like our no,
In diesem Land dieses Nein.
and if a Muslim in this country does not want to accept our no,
Dann, liebe Freunde,
then, dear friends, he is free to roll up his prayer rug, clamp it under his arm, and leave our country.
verlassen.
Both then and now, the main enemy under this ideology are Jews, who are perceived as powerful, as infiltrators. That hasn't changed. But migrants, Muslims, are also painted with the same brush. They're painted as unworthy, impure and violent, a blight on the German people.
German fraternities spokesman Philipp Stein has his office on the first floor of the same house in Halle where the identitarian movement has its bar. He also says that the German people will be displaced by immigration.
If 2, 3, or 4 million people immigrate and live in Germany for many, many decades, then of course a shift in the social majorities will at some point become a possibility. Just take a look at demographic statistics. You don't have to be right or left wing. It's simply a fact. The demographic trend here in Germany is basically happening to the detriment of the majority population.
So the descendants of people who live here now, no matter how long they live here, will always be immigrants and not Germans?
They're citizens, but not part of our people.
The trick behind this is to present demographic change as a larger threat. That's then dressed up in racist garb. There's no way to come up with the idea of a great replacement unless you're thinking in terms of ethnicity and employing racist categories.
The students at the Lessing High School in Cologne will soon be performing their play. For them, being a migrant or not is nothing special. Who's only German? 3? And who isn't? Everybody else. They don't see that as a problem. To the contrary.
We all came from somewhere else, settled here, and then built up our country. If you look at it that way, we're all strangers here. None of us are the real, true natives.
That's something that everyone has to decide for themselves, whether they see themselves as German or not. But it's not relevant to whether you belong or not.
It's very sad. We're all people. The fact that these prejudices still exist is really a pity. We should be past that in the 21st century.
But Europe is not past that. Here in Austria, far-right parties have gained an ever larger following in recent years. In May 2019, Heinz-Christian Strache had to step down as vice-chancellor and leader of the right-wing populist Freedom Party after a scandal that exposed underhanded political practices and their plan to limit the independence of the media. In Hungary, this process is well underway. The right-wing populist Fidesz party under Viktor Orban has virtually abolished the free press, packed TV stations with its own people, and closed down entire editorial offices. And he's manipulating the media for his electoral campaigns. In Italy, the far-right Lega Nord, led by anti-immigrant firebrand Matteo Salvini, have a powerful influence on policy. Their isolationist policies are one reason why thousands of refugees have drowned in the Mediterranean. The AfD on the campaign trail for the European elections. AfD leader Jörg Meuthen met with other European far-right leaders to found a radical pan-European alliance. The right is on the rise throughout Europe.
If you compare European countries, you can see the far right is quickly gaining ground in many of them. In some, right-wing extremists are now even part of governing coalitions at the national level.
After the end of the Cold War, right-wing populist and far-right parties played very little role in Europe, only reaching the 10% threshold in a few countries at the turn of the millennium. But in 2019, far-right parties have become a force to be reckoned with. In some countries, they've even been part of the government. A similar development took place after the First World War, which had led to the emergence of a number of democracies in Europe. 20 years later, most of them had reverted to authoritarian systems or dictatorships. The Weimar Republic resisted this tendency, but the Nazis were biding their time, waiting for a chance to overthrow democracy and establish a totalitarian regime. For a while, the economy was on the upswing, inflation was falling, and unemployment was lower than it had been in years. In October 1929, the global economic crisis brought that to a crashing halt. Until then, the Nazis had been a fringe party. Then unemployment exploded, bringing with it widespread poverty. Voters flocked to the Nazis. With little social security, many Germans lost their homes and went hungry. The Nazis seized on this widespread discontent and won the protest vote. From 1924 to 1933, the Nazis had made some significant electoral gains. But these did not come at the expense of the other political parties. Instead, voter turnout was rising rapidly. And it appears that many people who marked their ballot for the Nazis had previously been non-voters.
The NSDAP, the Nazi party, was what they called a people's party, a party of protest. It was the only party that was effective across the Weimar Republic. The AfD is also a mixture of socially established voters from the center who've drifted to the right and new voters, protest voters, who see it as a vehicle to express their dissatisfaction.
And we will keep this revolution going until politics in this country has been reversed by 180 degrees.
The AfD also capitalizes on protest. And it attracts people who didn't vote before. Almost a quarter of AfD supporters were previously non-voters. There's a clear parallel to the former Nazi party.
This also implies that not all Nazi voters around 1932 had suddenly become convinced racists and anti-Semites and National Socialists. The Nazis were harvesting the protest vote, and the AfD is doing that too.
Even in these economically stable times, the AfD has succeeded in sparking protests on the streets. Unemployment in Germany is low, and the economy seemingly robust. But the danger is still there. German society is becoming increasingly fragmented.
We're not a society that's getting poorer, we're a society that's getting richer. Anyone can, in theory, grow wealthy. But the upper 60% in our society keep getting richer, while the lower 40% haven't made any gains in the last 15 years. And that's a problem. Even with the expansion of opportunity, social inequality has grown.
This 40% is 32 million people in Germany, people who've seen no economic gains, or who have even lost ground. This state of affairs has become a threat to social stability. What would happen in the event of a new global economic crisis? If Germany experienced runaway inflation and mass unemployment?
The new radical right is pursuing a policy of ratcheting up social tensions. They want to push it to the point where tensions will erupt and destroy liberal democracy.
The Weimar Republic went from a peaceful democracy to a brutal dictatorship in just 14 years.
The trend is that we're very gradually seeing a return to those things. Social polarization, right-wing extremism, the rise of an anti-democratic party, the rise of right-wing violence, a state and a government that no longer seem to be able to cope with this situation. All of those elements existed in the Weimar Republic. We're not repeating that history, but we must draw on our knowledge of what happened to the Weimar Republic to make sure it doesn't happen again.